Your host, Scott Spratt, writer for Football Outsiders. It's 1 p.m. Eastern time on Friday heading into Week 11, so we're doing our live stream fantasy preview for all the Week 11 games. And joining me today, special guest, Ryan Hallman from Fantasy Alarm, a projections guy, much like myself, so today may get really, really nerdy. Ryan, what's going on?
Not too much, Scott. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to hoping that Week 11 might be a little more normal than Week 9 and Week 10 have been, because it's been crazy the last couple of weeks.
Well, I mean, it's been upset city for the favorite teams from a real NFL sense, from a gambling sense, but there's been some intriguing fantasy stuff too. And we're going to hit on a major fantasy topic for every game the rest of the weekend. Before we get there, let me mention too that FO Plus is now on sale for 99 cents per week for annual subscriptions. It's a limited time offer, so you can get all of our stats, analysis, fantasy, and betting info. Don't miss out on that while you can get it. footballoutsiders.com/subscribe, or check the link in the show description to figure out the info for that. Ryan, let's get started with the first game on Sunday, Colts at Bills. That's 1 p.m. in Buffalo. 40 degrees with a 59% chance of light rain and 17-mile-per-hour winds, potential gusts to 30 miles per hour. I read the weather for all the games, and it's been kind of, for September and October, it doesn't really matter too much. This is one of the first weekends when weather's really playing a role with what's going on here. So I'll ask it for this game, but it's going to apply to a few other ones. When does weather start factoring into your fantasy decisions, or does it ever? Especially talking about a player like Josh Allen or whatever. Maybe it just doesn't matter to you.
I think it has to a certain degree, especially with the rain, with the wet ball. I think it comes into play in this game. The Titans are generally, a fair weather, city. Most of their division is indoors, so they necessarily might not play in as much Northeast fun as Buffalo might. So yeah, when West Coast teams come east, dome teams play in the weather. I think comes into play more than, say, Buffalo's, pretty used to it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably is easier for a home team than it is for a road team. But at least in the research that I've done, the play calling tendencies are kind of what change the most, and they can change for both the home team and the road team. And by my estimates, I would say higher winds tend to increase run plays by 4% per game. Heavy precipitation increases it by about 10% per game. And by and large, I would say cold weather, unless you're getting under 30 degrees, it's not going to really play that much of a role. But pretty much all weather elements shift play calling from the pass toward the run. So say, that may affect your decisions with a player like Emmanuel Sanders or a Cole Beasley, a player that's kind of a little bit more borderline. But like when you're talking about somebody as good as Josh Allen, for instance, so I'm projecting him to lose 0.9 projected fantasy points. It sounds like a lot, but he's still my number one quarterback. The fact that he runs as well as passes, I think kind of plays a huge role here. And so it's interesting in that respect. Ryan, my DFS play for this game, I'm kind of going against myself a little bit here in recommending a pass catcher, but I think Dawson Knox is just really well priced at 4,000 in DraftKings. I think that's 500 too low. I think it may be a reaction to the fact that he had just one catch for 17 yards in his return from a broken hand last week. But since he played 84% of snaps, which is pretty much his pre-injury workload, I'm saying that I think he's probably back to full health. And I'm just kind of making a play at a potential touchdown here at tight end. What are your thoughts on Knox this week?
Definitely like that. I have him in some best balls coming into the year. I was kind of hoping that he might take this step, and he has, and I totally agree. Not only maybe the weather coming into play, but the dud that he threw up last week. But like you said, it was his first game back. Necessarily, maybe wasn't a little sure about how the hand would react. But him and Josh Allen certainly have a nice chemistry, and 4,000 I think is a great price. I totally agree with your pick.
Yeah, I mean, in weeks 1 to 6, he was leading the position with 5 touchdowns. And even though he was kind of a surplus over the expected total there, it was still second best by expected touchdowns behind just Tyler Higbee. So I think pretty good option there as more of a best ball. I love it in that kind of format because, again, it's maybe touchdown or bust, but decent chance to score this weekend. Next on the list, we have the Ravens at Bears, 1 p.m. in Chicago, another weather game here with 45 degrees, 25% chance of light rain, and 10-mile-per-hour winds. But let's focus something a little bit more on the players here, which is Justin Fields related. He had his first, I would say, really nice passing game before the team had to bye last week. Do you think that's something that's going to continue going forward? Can he continue to have success passing the ball and maybe becoming a fantasy option?
I do like what I've seen. I trashed him repeatedly the first 2 months of the season. He just looked clueless out there. But starting with the game against San Francisco, he ran for 100 yards. Started to look a little more confident. The last game before their bye, he played well, threw the ball well. Like I said, I think it was 291 yards, so almost threw for 300 yards.
Yeah.
Seems like they're letting the reins off him a little bit more. Seems like they're going with his athleticism a little more, which is, a lot of what people liked coming into the draft. So it seems like the Bears maybe are starting to figure out how to use him. He's gaining a little bit of confidence. The Ravens give up the most yards per game against the pass, shockingly enough. Not a ton of touchdowns, but the most yards per game. So, yeah, I think the Fields has a chance to continue to succeed. And if you're, looking to stream a quarterback this week, perhaps you probably can do worse than him.
So, yeah, we do a lot of efficiency talk at Football Outsiders, thinking about things like passing DVOA. And if you look at that, he still looks like one of the worst few quarterbacks in the league as a passer. But I'll say two things about that. One, that is also heavily influenced by how many sacks a player is taking. And the Bears have an 11.7% adjusted sack rate. That's by far the worst. That's something that's trending a little bit better. And while it's probably going to continue to affect Fields to a certain extent the rest of the way, that isn't necessarily a killer from a fantasy perspective, because maybe he's turning the ball over a little bit, throwing more interceptions because of the pressure. But if he can counterbalance it with the passing yardage, the touchdowns, it's okay. And then I'll say, too, that the trends with the passing DVOA are looking better. The first start, it was just catastrophic. It was negative 119%. He was 119% worse than an average passer that week. That's not exactly what you're looking for. I'm not blaming him. I'm just saying that's what it was. But in 2 of the last 4 games, he's been an above average passer by passing DVOA. So even though the total for the full season as a starter looks really bad, I think it's trending. And you brought up the main point for me here, Ryan. It's like he doesn't have to get that good as a passer this year to be competent from a fantasy perspective, because after carrying the ball just 3 times in his first 3 starts, it's 6, 8, 10, and 8 carries the last 4. He's averaged 16.5 fantasy points per game since week 7. That's 17th highest at the position. Even if he's throwing for 250 yards in a game and not the 300 that he nearly hit before the bye, that could really work for you. So I don't think I'm going to be starting him against the Ravens this week, but I think it's an intriguing one where it's like, yeah, their defense isn't as good. And if he has success here, I'm going to start to really buy into it as an option, and even in shallower leagues. Now, that being said, my DFS play is actually in the running game here with David Montgomery, 5,500 in DraftKings. I think that's mildly underpriced at 300, but there's not a guy here that super stands out in this game. But I'll say that, like you mentioned with the Ravens being not as good of a pass defense as you might have expected coming into the year, I think that's probably true from a running perspective as well. And then in particular, I just feel like Montgomery is getting a lot more run than Khalil Herbert, despite Herbert's success in his absence. He played 85% of snaps versus just 16% for Herbert before the bye. So I think it's clearly back to a bell cow situation for Montgomery, and the prices may not reflect it. What do you think?
Totally agree. The minute that he was healthy, like you said, he took the job right back over. So that, you like to see that with Herbert. Like, they had great success while Montgomery was out. So it's kind of a different situation, like we saw in New England last night with Stevenson. Was very good when Harris was out, and then last night they pretty much split, and Stevenson did a little bit better. There was no such thing with the Bears. Montgomery came back, took over all the carries, did very well. It was nice to see him come back for the bye. Now he's had an extra week to rest. So I think 5,500 is a great price on DraftKings, and I expect him to have another very solid game, both running the ball, and he's a good pass catcher too.
Mm-hmm. So my untrained eye with Herbert, I really liked what I saw from him as the temporary starter. I thought his vision was really good, and that can be a tricky thing to sort of see statistically. But I will say that while he and Montgomery had very similar rushing success rates this year, both around 47%, Montgomery has been dramatically better in terms of yards after contact per attempt. So I think even though if you're looking at some of the more basic metrics, you might say, it seems like Herbert's just as good as Montgomery. I think Montgomery's probably had a tougher road to sled on his carries and has performed well despite that. So I do think it's pretty clear to me, at least right now, that Montgomery is the better player. And I think he's going to have a ton of work this week too. All right, let's move on to the third game of the week. Lions at Browns, 1 p.m. Eastern time in Cleveland, 46 degrees, 57% chance of light rain, and 14-mile-per-hour winds. I think this is maybe the last game that I think has a major weather implication here. Maybe not a ton of scoring anyway with these offenses, at least beyond the Browns rushing game. But maybe this is kind of a broader question going over the rest of the year, Ryan. Do you think there's any Browns receiver that could pop from fantasy perspective now that Odell Beckham is out of town and in L.A.?
Pop, I'm not sure. Donovan Peoples-Jones, I know, has had a couple of big games and then does nothing another week. Jarvis Landry is kind of the slow and steady, wins the race, but none of his games are really all that exciting. And Rashard Higgins, he's a 4th, 5th receiver, let's be honest, but forced into a bigger role because of injuries and everything. And then Anthony Schwartz, will pop a big play every once in a while. So if I had to pick one, it would probably be Peoples-Jones. If you're a PPR league and you like the conservative play, Jarvis Landry is okay. I don't really love any of them. Baker Mayfield is playing on one knee, half a shoulder, and everything else, trying to tough it out there. And they're a run-first team to begin with anyway. I think Chubb was brought back off the COVID list, so I don't really have a lot of confidence in any of them, no.
I mean, I can't disagree with you there, Ryan, honestly. Part of it is that the team is playing 3 tight ends, at least 39% of snaps. And that kind of leads to their run nature. So they're just not going to throw the ball a ton, even though I think at this point it is clear what the pecking order is among wide receivers. Last week, Peoples-Jones played 85%, Jarvis Landry played 80%, and then Rashard Higgins played 44% of snaps. So it's Peoples-Jones, Landry, and then bust a wide receiver. But the trick of it is you see that number for Peoples-Jones. They're like, hey, he's a full-time starter now. Things must have changed since Beckham left. But he played 59% or more of snaps his 7 previous games too, and had just 18 targets over those 7 games. So even though he has, I guess, less competition from a real sense, I don't think it's going to necessarily lead to more than an occasional big game. I wouldn't be relying on him from a fantasy perspective. Unsurprisingly, then you might say that my DFS thoughts are kind of riding with a running back situation here. I originally tabbed D'Ernest Johnson as a possibility here. He's 5,600 in DraftKings. But Chubb, as you mentioned, just got activated from the COVID list. So I think it's probably going to be back to usual for him. But Ernest Johnson, I mean, he is going to be playing second fiddle for a team that has gotten a lot of run out of that with Kareem Hunt being healthy, and Hunt is out again this week. Would you start Johnson in a DFS sense as the secondary back here, or is Chubb pretty much the only guy you're going with in this spot?
I do like Chubb. I think if the pricing came out before we knew Chubb was activated and Johnson was maybe $1,000 less than he was. I mean, you're looking at D'Ernest Johnson at 56. We just talked about David Montgomery at 55. I think
clear choice between those two, right?
Yeah. So I think the unfortunately for Johnson, I think that the pricing come out earlier the week before we knew if Chubb was going to play kind of hurts him. So I would probably lean Chubb pretty heavily there.
I agree with that. Now, I will point out that it's interesting that Johnson has 2.7 yards after contact per attempt this season. That's top 5 among running backs with 25 or more carries. Chubb and Hunt, I think, are first and third in that. So I've been trying to unpack whether or not somehow the Browns' great blocking is leading to extra yards after contact or not. I think it may be the case the Browns just have 3 really, really good backs, which is a pretty sweet spot to be in. But from a fantasy perspective, I would say Johnson is more fun as a player than he might be from a fantasy perspective in this spot. But again, if the Browns could lead up by multiple scores, maybe they can ride both of these guys to some extra stuff. So I guess we'll see. I'm probably not going to pull the trigger, but maybe in a long shot type of sense, maybe he could have some work in the third and fourth quarters.
Yeah, I definitely think so. If he scored a touchdown on Sunday, would I be surprised? Not at all. I just don't know. I'm guessing his workload is probably going to be capped around 10 carries unless the game really gets out of hand, which I don't know if, Cleveland's offense lends itself to being out of it. But if Tim Boyle is starting at quarterback for the Lions, who knows? The whole Detroit offense is pretty much garbage. So
are you saying that's going to be a huge upgrade over Jared Goff? So it may be closer than we were thinking is what you
I said Tim Boyle sounds more like your 8th grade social studies teacher than an NFL quarterback. So I'm not sure if he's going to, as bad as Goff has been, I'm not sure he's going to be much better.
Can't argue with you there. So Joey sucks on the YouTube chat. And I'll mention again, we're live on YouTube among other platforms that you can watch us on the live stream. If you jump on YouTube, you can chat with us and ask us questions. Joey Sucks asks, are there any worries about how Baker's injury might impact the efficacy of the run game? And I'll say that while I originally had some concerns, I think Baker's had shoulder issues now for going on about 5 or 6 weeks that I know about. And the fact is they've continued to run with success. I know they've had some up and down games, but they're still, I think, top 3 in adjusted line yards. So getting great blocking up front. All of these guys have had a ton of success. It's really more an issue of trying to figure out who's going to play what role. Cause we're not used to seeing Chubb and Johnson on the field at the same time. And we may not be used to it when they get Hunt back, having all 3 of them seem like good players. So that's really more my concern, Ryan.
Yeah, and I also don't think Case Keenum is the worst backup quarterback in the league. It's not like, some of these guys that come out there and the offense just can't move. I mean, he's at least competent. So it's not like, they know he can't throw. He's at least good enough where I think he can still at least run the offense in a somewhat respectable way.
Agreed. We got some more questions flooding in. Keep those coming. We're going to hold a lot of the questions toward the end of the show and hit on them later when they're kind of off topic. For now, we're going to keep going with the fantasy preview, moving over to the Texans at Titans game. That's 1 p.m. Eastern time in Tennessee, 54 degrees and clear with 11 mile per hour winds. We've seen it a couple of weeks now, Ryan, but do you think there's any Titans running back worth starting in fantasy? With Derrick Henry being out, it seems like kind of a 3-back committee at this point, which may not be too attractive.
It's not, and each guy kind of has his own thing. Like Adrian Peterson, I feel like is the goal line guy. I feel like Deonta Foreman, a guy who I've liked for a couple of years. I was thinking about this yesterday, and between Houston and a couple other spots, he's always kind of had a chance and never really come through. So this year, when he landed on the Titans, I'm like, you know what, I'm done with this guy. And finally, now he's like starting to play okay. As soon as I just let him go. So he's got a little bit more work in the week before, so I think he has probably the best chance of being the guy. But as far as week 11 is concerned, it's kind of, you're just picking out of a hat. But I think it's definitely between Foreman and Peterson. If I had to pick one, it would be Foreman.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too. Peterson has played 33% of snaps each of the last 2 weeks, but Foreman jumped up from 21% in week 9 to 35% last week. So if there's any trending happening, it may be more him. It runs a little bit counter to what I was thinking that Peterson kind of being off the street at his age, maybe he would need some build-up time. Maybe that could still happen, but you may be right here about Foreman too, because like he was an effective and efficient runner pre-injury, and I think it's easy to kind of conflate an Achilles injury with an ACL injury, but Achilles injuries are just often so much more devastating to a career. I think that probably derailed him, so it's a little bit less surprising that it's taken a few years for him to find out some work again. Hope it can work out for him. I think that'd be really cool. From a DFS perspective, without having the Titans running back that you trust, it kind of gets a little bit shaky here. I'll throw out Marcus Johnson as a possible price-saving option. He's only 3,500 in DraftKings. What's interesting here is that he jumped from a 5% snap share in week 9 to 63% in week 10 because Julio Jones landed on IR. So maybe he's the second wide receiver for this team. Weirdly, the Texans are a lot better in defensive number 1 receivers than other guys. I don't necessarily think they have a standout cornerback, but their defense is better than you would expect. Is it to the point where you would consider playing Johnson, or is that a little bit too deep of a flyer for your tastes?
I mean, I think it depends on your roster construction. If you have a guy at running back, or you want to pay up for quarterback, or maybe that tight end, I don't think there's a problem with him as a dart throw at 3,500. I mean, it's a really cheap price, and he had 100 yards. I do think part of the problem with A.J. Brown last week was the Saints have Marshawn Lattimore, who is one of the better corners in the league, and was able to kind of handle him, I wouldn't say completely one-on-one, but probably needed less defensive help than Desmond King or Terrence Marshall or anyone from the Texans are going to have with Brown. So I do think it's going to be a good day for A.J. Brown, but Marcus Johnson, 3,500 is really hard to argue with I think he's clearly the second receiver on the team against the Texans defense started out the season pretty well, and I think it's kind of starting to slip. So I think some of their numbers might be some early season aided.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you there. All right, next up on the list, Packers at Vikings. That's 1 p.m. Eastern time in the Dome in Minnesota. The Packers have gone through a series of injuries or absences to some key players in recent weeks. Unfortunately, the most recent one is Aaron Jones, going to miss a couple of games probably with an MCL sprain, I believe. How are the Packers going to handle that? Is it going to shift the workload all toward A.J. Dillon? Are they going to be passing more? What do you think is going to happen with the Packers offense that you would handle then from a fantasy perspective?
I have a feeling it's probably going to stay pretty close to the way they normally would. A.J. Dillon has done nothing but show success when Aaron Jones has been out between last year, the playoffs and this year. I mean, he's shown he can handle the load. He's catching some balls out of the backfield. I've been very impressed with what I've seen when they've put him into action. So I have no thoughts that it's going to be any major shift. I think it's going to be pretty much status quo, and I think A.J. Dillon's going to have a big game.
Yeah, it's weird when you look at Dillon. So he's 247 pounds, and given that Matt LaFleur is coming out of Tennessee, you kind of got the sense that he was looking for his version of Derrick Henry, right? And that's kind of what I expected. And I think he's done that as a runner. He's got 2.8 yards after contact per attempt since the start of last year. That's the 4th highest among running backs with 50-plus carries. Henry is basically right there too. But what you said here, I think, is true. It's been surprising how effective he's been as a receiver. He's got 4.1 yards after the catch plus per catch since 2020. I know that's a bit of a mouthful. It's basically saying that when he catches the ball, he's a little bit more elusive than you would expect from an average player, never mind a player that's 247 pounds. So I think it may be the case that he can handle a bell cow type of role. Now, I'm not saying he's going to get the 4.7 targets per game that Aaron Jones was getting with the team, but I think it's not going to be the split that he and Jones had together. I mean, last week, Dillon played 49% of snaps versus just 4% for Patrick Taylor. So it's pretty dominant, one-sided there. And I don't know who else they would have. So Kylan Hill was the 6th-round rookie that I think they were really high on from his work in the preseason. He tore his ACL a few weeks ago. They're just kind of out of bodies. So I assume they're going to kind of roll with Dillon more than anyone else. In at least for the next week or two, unless Jones end up missing more time. He's only 7,000 in FanDuel. I think that's way, way underpriced. Like, he's probably going to be one of the more heavily owned players this week from a DFS perspective, but I would go all in on him. I don't know if you feel that way too.
Oh, absolutely. Like you said, everything you said is just, I echo it all. I think he's definitely going to be the major focus of the offense. Vikings, you can run, you can throw on them, you can score on them. I think it's going to be a Dillon day all day.
Absolutely. All right, next up, Dolphins Jets, 1 p.m. in New York, 51 degrees and clear. Can you trust Elijah Moore in fantasy at this point? He's had some really nice fantasy days the last 2 weeks, 84 yards, 2 touchdowns, followed by 44 yards and 1 touchdown. But I don't know if his workloads are kind of justifying it. What do you think, Ryan?
They always say garbage time points count as much as everything else. So and the Jets have had a whole lot of garbage time lately. I think he's working his way in. Corey Davis is probably still the number one, but I think it's pretty blurred at this point. And Moore has been finding the end zone. So, it might take a while for to get the points. You might not get it in the first quarter, but they certainly have found the way to get him the ball, get him in the end zone. What's Joe Flacco going to be? That's the number one question. Can he run the offense? Hasn't really played at all this year. The Dolphins defense has looked resurgent in the past couple of weeks. Moore definitely has some question marks, but I think if you're trusting somebody on this team, that's probably the way to go.
See, I really want to. I mean, I think Moore is a really talented player and a player that should be playing more than he's had a chance to, but I don't think it's a question mark. I mean, I think Davis is clearly the number one receiver on this team. Davis missed the game 2 weeks ago, and that's when Moore had to jump up to a 60% snap share, had his 2 touchdowns. But Moore dropped back down to a 56% share last week. Davis played 84%, and then the slot receiver Jamison Crowder played 83%. So at least based on snap shares, it paints a pretty clear picture that he's not the top of this list. And while he has had the production itself, I would say he's been kind of lucky in scoring touchdowns from longer range. And so he's got 3 touchdowns the last 3 weeks. I think he only has 1.3 expected touchdowns all season. That's a metric that looks at both distance from the end zone and air yards to say how often do players score when they get the ball where they get it. And like some of that's probably Moore being a really good player himself. But I think it's pretty lucky that he's been where he's been the last few weeks. I'm ranking him 50th among wide receivers in PPR formats this week. And granted, that's down a smidge because it's a bad venue and weather situation here. It doesn't really put him near my fantasy lineups right now. You think I'm just being a little bit too pessimistic here? I'm hoping that it changes, but just for now, I'm not optimistic yet.
No, I mean, data is what it is. You can't really argue with statistics. And you're right. I mean, one of the touchdowns against the Colts, I think Xavier Rhodes fell down. So, I mean, it was basically in the end zone by himself. And the other problem is how many points are the Jets going to score? So that also, it doesn't, come into play. But yeah, the production has been nice lately. Can it continue? We'll find out. I have a hard time trusting anyone on the Jets, but he seems to at least be making the most meaningful plays on the team. So, I certainly don't fault you at all for not vaulting him into your lineups or anyone on that team.
Not trusting anyone on the Jets makes a lot of sense. Mix of Waves says it's Joe Flacco time. So that pretty much says it all. And so you might not be surprised to hear that from a DFS perspective in this game, I'm looking more at the Dolphins side, potentially at Tua Tagovailoa here. He's just 4,600 in DraftKings. I think that's pretty significantly underpriced, 800 underpriced. If you look at his full season stats, it doesn't look great. So he's averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game. That's in the range with Jimmy Garoppolo's at 16.2, Teddy Bridgewater's at 16. My guy, Sam Darnold, 15.9. You don't want to be down there with Sam Darnold, right? But I think it's a bit of a trick because, again, Tua has had 2 non-full games. In week 2, he had just 4 pass attempts before he left hurt. And then in week 10 last week, he came in for, an injured substitute or whatever, only had 13 pass attempts. So I'm kind of slicing and dicing it to get to a pretty small sample. But in his healthy handful of starts, Tagovailoa has averaged 19.6 fantasy points per game. That would be the 11th highest among quarterbacks, just between Kirk Cousins and Joe Burrow. Do you buy into that at all? I feel like Tagovailoa is kind of making a step forward, but it doesn't really seem like the Dolphins have been treating it that way. What do you make of the sophomore quarterback?
I like him. We came into the year. I work with Howard Bender over at Fantasy Alarm, and we had a bet going. He had Sam Darnold, and I had Tua going into the year. Now they both have been hurt.
World beaters.
So, yeah, the bet is blown up, but I mean that's just I really like them coming into the year. Obviously, he won't have Devontae Parker, but Jalen Waddle's looked really good. Mike Gesicki, no catches last week, but who the heck ever figured that? He's got a couple of decent weapons. The Jets are just god-awful on defense. They've just been giving up points in bunches. I think it's like 160 in the last 4 weeks or something like that.
Yeah.
It couldn't be a better matchup. The weather looks pretty solid. At least no rain or heavy wind. He's been making the best of what limited weapons he's had all season long. So if you are trying to do a value quarterback, I don't know how much better you can find than Tua against the Jets for $4,600.
Agreed. And we have some questions on some of these players, but I'm going to hold all of these like lineup questions and these trade questions toward the end. But guys, keep peppering them. We're going to get to it in a later section in the show. For now, though, Saints at Eagles, 1 p.m. in Philadelphia, 52 degrees and clear. I should have followed up on this before the start of the show. I don't know whether Miles Sanders is going to play this week, but the team I think has activated him from IR such that he would be eligible to return any of the next 3 weeks. Ryan, what do you think is going to happen to the Eagles' backfield when Sanders rejoins this, either maybe this week or maybe one of the next 2?
I mean, is a bigger mess an option? Like, I don't know. Before his injury, he wasn't exactly the bell cow then either. So I don't expect him to come back and just take it over. I think what little Kenneth Gainwell is getting will be gone. And I think it'll probably be him and Jordan Howard. I think Boston Scott will probably get cut down a little bit more as well, as Howard will kind of be the thunder to Sanders. I had lightning. I have to use air quotes because I'm not even sure he's got lightning, but I think it'll be more those two guys when he comes back. But I don't expect giant success, but they're just running the ball so much that I think the volume will be there that, they both could have some potential to be in fantasy lineups, not DFS lineups, but season-long lineups.
So, I'm a little bit skeptical even on that front because Howard's been really productive the last 3 weeks. I mean, undeniably so. 41 carries, 211 yards, 3 touchdowns the last 3 games. But he's had a 32.5% carry share in that time. That's barely inside the top 40 at the position. To me, it kind of paints a picture of this is kind of a 3-back committee as well. But the thing of it is that the Eagles have just had a really friendly schedule for running backs from a fantasy perspective in recent weeks, playing the Lions, the Chargers, and Broncos. They rank 29th, 32nd, and 23rd in run defense DVOA, so all bottom 10. This week, the Saints rank first. Like, they are a really tough defense to go against, I mean, from every perspective, but I would say particularly for running backs because they hurt their efficiency. They also cut down on runs per game. Honestly, I wouldn't be stunned if the Eagles kind of went back to some of their early season frustrating strategy from a fantasy perspective, but more Jalen Hurts runs, more screen game, a little bit less traditional carries, which could hurt Jordan Howard. I think it would hurt Miles Sanders if he ended up playing as well. So I'd say I'm not really excited about any of these backs going forward, no matter how the injuries shake out. So I don't know. I'm hoping that they're going to stick with the more balance of late. It's worked better for them, but I don't know if the schedule is going to allow for it. We'll have to just see. From a DFS perspective, again, I'm kind of taking the other side of this because of what I just explained. I think Adam Trautman starting to pique my interest again. He was a big sleeper in the early season that hasn't really worked out, but he's still pretty inexpensive at $4,800 in FanDuel, and he's played 80% of snaps or more in 5 straight games. And here are his targets since week 3 per game: 1, 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, and 6. So those last 3 games, 17% target share. That's tied for 13th among tight ends. You think things are starting to turn around a little bit for Trautman? Or do you think maybe the Saints, the offense isn't really going any great shakes here? Is it like maybe it's not enough? But what do you think about Trautman? Has it piqued your interest at all?
I don't think the offense has any great shakes, but I think you'll also notice the last 3 weeks when we saw the 6-7-6 was Trevor Siemian. Yep. And when you ever have a quarterback change, you always have to, they have their favorite receiver or they have their go-to position. So clearly he's favoring the tight end more than Jameis Winston did. Taysom Hill doesn't look like he's going to play. None of the wide receivers are consistently good. Harris and Callaway can make some big plays, and Traquan Smith is decent as well, but none of them are world beaters. Alvin Kamara is banged up, so some of the targets that he might get could be up for grabs if he doesn't play a full complement of snaps. So I do like Trautman. I think he's a sneaky good play this week. I think the Eagles are very good against the tight end. I don't expect this to be a very highly scored game on either side. So if you're going to pick someone out of this, I think you're good at Trautman with a pretty cheap price at tight end.
Yeah, I also think Trautman's been really unlucky from a touchdown perspective. I mean, some of that in the early season was the team relying more on Juwan Johnson, who is kind of faded toward the background, was actually a healthy inactive a couple of weeks ago. So I think Trautman has asserted himself there, but also Trautman has 1.8 expected touchdowns on the season versus no actual scores, and is one of the top 5 shortfall guys at the position there. So he's one of the players I think is going to score a little bit more over the second half, and at such an inexpensive price in FanDuel, that may be an option for you if you're looking to save a bit of cash at the position. Okay, let's keep going. Washington at the Panthers, 1 p.m. Eastern time in Carolina, 52 degrees and clear. I'm a Panthers fan, by the way, so I've been celebrating Cam Newton all week. Very excited to have him back in town. But Ryan, we need somebody that's not quite as biased as I am to tell me what's going to happen here with Cam Newton, both from his own fantasy perspective and is he going to change the skill players on the team's fantasy values going forward too?
I mean, I hope so, because Sam Darnold has really gone, fell off a cliff. But last week they pretty much just put him in all the perfect situations. They gave him the ball at the 1 yard line. It was like, here, fall into the end zone. And then he threw a 2 yard touchdown, Robbie Anderson. So they seem like they kind of cherry picked the perfect situations for Cam to succeed. Now it's his first home game, but I know there's a lot of hubbub and everyone's very excited. But I'm still thinking of what I saw last year in New England when, he couldn't throw the ball more than 5 yards down the field and, was I would say more of a detriment than a help. Yeah. Hopefully the time off helped. I mean, and I know Mac Jones has played pretty well, but he didn't beat out a rookie in training camp. And I know there was the COVID problems and all that, but he wasn't rocking the world in August either. So I am not 100% on the Cam train. I'm hoping he does well. I don't wish, ill on him, but I need to see a little bit more of a full game than the kind of the cherry picking touchdowns they gave him last week before I'm too excited about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's all fair, but that said, I am probably more optimistic about Cam than most people would be. And it's a couple of reasons. One, you mentioned how he didn't win the job in the preseason, but I will say from the handful of throws I saw in the preseason, I thought his shoulder health looked better. And one of the big pieces of this is he had shoulder surgery in 2020. And we've been waiting for Cam to get healthy for the last 5 years, right? But it did look like the mechanics of his throwing were a little bit better. It's not a lot to trust, but I've always kind of contended too that Cam was unfairly judged a bit by some of the accuracy numbers, like completion percentage, when so much of that was style. I mean, in 2017 he completed 59% of his passes. In 2018 he completed 68% of his passes, and really all that changed is that he started throwing the ball to Christian McCaffrey all the time, right? It's like it's choices about depth of throw, about who you're targeting, about the aggressiveness that you're pushing the ball down the field. I don't think Cam has the arm to probably do that anymore with all of the shoulder injuries that he suffered, but I think that he can be accurate enough, even if he's not one of the leading pass completion guys in the league, given that he still has McCaffrey, hopefully going forward with the Panthers here. I think he has a chance to have a lot of value, given that he'll probably be scoring touchdowns himself near the goal line like he did last week. Now, in terms of his teammates, I will point out something that's a little bit scary. I know that Sam Darnold was no great shakes, but he did target DJ Moore 7 times in the end zone the first 9 weeks. That put Moore top 10 at the position and end zone targets. Cam Newton targeted Moore just 4 times in the end zone in 16 games together in 2018 and 2019. The fact that Newton scores so much near the goal line tends to mean that he doesn't throw the ball to his main targets. I mean, I'm worried that DJ Moore may have an Allen Robinson type of fall from grace from a fantasy perspective here. Do you see that as being a possibility at all, Ryan?
Yeah, I definitely see that as a possibility. Any team where you have DJ Moore, you're really kind of holding your breath this week and hoping that you see, because he wasn't. I know Cam wasn't the quarterback most of the week last week, but he didn't have a very good week last week either. It was obviously falling apart when Darnold wasn't barely completing any passes. Yeah. So it's been a rough few weeks for DJ Moore. So I think you're really going in, starting him, of course, but, with a lot of trepidation coming into this weekend and hoping that you see a big change and a nice game for him.
Yeah, not starting him in DFS, I'll point out. But from a DFS perspective, this is kind of a weird quirk that I noticed, Ryan. Newton is 5,100 in DraftKings, which I think is $800 underpriced. He's actually the 27th most expensive quarterback in DraftKings this week, but he's 7,500 in FanDuel, the 10th most expensive quarterback, and at a price that I think is overpriced. It's probably not that surprising because, one, Newton is newly with the team, and I don't think there's even any certainty about whether he's going to be starting this game. There's been some buzz that maybe it's still PJ Walker. I don't think that's the case, but it's really kind of weird. Like I would say he actually makes a lot of sense for me in a DraftKings setting, but I would go nowhere near him in FanDuel. And that's something that I probably don't say too often.
I saw right before we started that he was supposed to start, but Walker was going to play, which I'm not sure what exactly that means. So I don't know if that's, Matt Rule toying with the media or what it is. But I think Cam's going to start, and I think if he doesn't play all the snaps, I expect him to play vast majority. Yeah, and if he throws one touchdown and runs in another, at 5,100 on DraftKings, that's a good value.
Absolutely. Matt Rule may be going back to the well from last week. While saying that Cam wasn't the starter, I think maybe influenced Kyler Murray to wait another week before he came back. So that was good news for the Panthers. Maybe they're going to try to run that script back again. All right, next up, 49ers at Jaguars, 1 p.m. Eastern time in Jacksonville, 68 degrees and clear. Ryan, what should you do with Brandon Aiyuk at this point? I mean, it seemed to be trending in a positive direction, but then he fell off to 3 catches for 26 yards on 4 targets in week 10. Is that a distressing sign, or do you still think this is trending upward?
Well, if you admitted you're a Panthers fan, I'll admit I'm a 49ers fan. And no, I just can't play this game with Aiyuk anymore. A couple times this year, it's been trending up and it goes right back down again. You had that one nice game with 6 catches and a touchdown, and then we saw, that disaster again last week. So, if you're in desperation mode, and you have 2 guys on bye and someone else is hurt and he's on your roster, sure, give him. But if you're in any kind of situation where you have something, you can't trust him anymore. It's just not happening. It's just not, like you said, 4 targets. That's not enough, for sustained fantasy success. And Jacksonville's secondary honestly isn't that terrible. And I do just think most of it is going through Samuel and most of it's going through Kittle. I just can't see Aiyuk having, or I know there's not enough evidence to be confident that Aiyuk is going to have a good fantasy game.
Here, let me try to see if I can cheer you up a little bit here, since now that I know that you're a 49ers fan. Here are Aiyuk's snap shares by week since week 4, I think it is: 67, 71, 71, 88, 93, and 90%. So the arrow is pointed clearly up, even last week when he only had the 4 targets. Last week, it's possible last week was a kind of just a quirky game. So the Rams, who they were playing, they play more 2 high safeties than pretty much any team in the league. It's a style of defense that tries to limit big plays and really invites a team to run against them. And the 49ers ran incredibly well against them, right? So, there really wasn't any reason to throw the ball at anybody. I know that the Debo and Kittle had some pretty nice days from a fantasy perspective, but some of Samuel's production was as a runner too. So I wonder if different teams playing different styles of defense might help Aiyuk going forward, even if they might have better players from a pass defense perspective. So I'm not totally off it. I have Aiyuk 43rd among wide receivers in PPR formats this week. That may not be a starter for you in a traditional format, but it's definitely, in my mind, still trending positively. Did I cheer you up? Did I talk you into it at all? You happy with Aiyuk yet?
I mean, I do have one team where I continue to start him. That team's not doing well, obviously. But it's just maybe I have too much emotion. But it's week after week. He had the fumble a couple weeks ago, and Shanahan didn't pull him, so that was a little bit positive too. But then just last week, they had a good game and still ended up with 26 yards. So, I'm hopeful, but I'm not too hopeful.
Fair. I'm glad you're here, though, given that your 49ers background. You can maybe help me out with this, because in DFS, I'm suggesting Jeffery Wilson might be an option at $5,000 in FanDuel. I think that's $400 underpriced. It's obviously, I think, in my mind, a good matchup. I mean, the Jaguars, they're better as a run defense from a DVOA perspective than you would expect at 7th, but they increase run plays by 5% per game. It's just a situation where teams tend to build leads and then enable extra rushing opportunities. But the question is really about Elijah Mitchell's health, because he broke a finger in week 10. And I don't really know what to make of this. I don't know if he's going to play. One, if he doesn't play, would Wilson be a big beneficiary, or would that be more of a Trey Sermon spot? I don't know. Can you unpack this 49ers running game given the Mitchell injury?
Sure. Mitchell, as far as I saw today, is a game time decision. So, unfortunately, we won't find out until Sunday probably. But I think either way, Wilson is in play. You talked about the 49ers run the ball last week against the Rams. Not only do they run a ton, they run among the best in football. They have the offensive lineman pull, and they do all kinds of misdirection, and they're very tough to figure out. But they also do it a lot, so there's a chance for more than one guy to be fantasy relevant. So I think even if Mitchell plays, Wilson isn't a terrible option. If Mitchell doesn't play, I love Wilson then, because even like you said, Jaguars aren't that bad against the run. I don't think Kyle Shanahan wants to give Trey Sermon any kind of meaningful carries. He hasn't all season long. They drafted him in the second round. They drafted Mitchell in the sixth round, and Mitchell came in and ran away with the job. So everything Sermon has done hasn't seemed to be good enough. So I expect if Mitchell is out, that Wilson will get the lion's share of the carries and will be an absolute value at 5,000. So either way, but obviously he's a great play if Mitchell happens to miss the game.
I do think it's an interesting thought to potentially play Wilson even if Mitchell does play. And one thing that piques my interest there is that Wilson has 0.64 rushing touchdowns and 0.50 expected rushing touchdowns per game since the start of last season. That's the second number, which is again lower, is still 21st among running backs with 20 or more carries over that period. It's ahead of Aaron Jones. It's ahead of Kareem Hunt. So while we don't necessarily think of Jeff Wilson as being the type of second running back that you can trust from a fantasy perspective, he kind of scores a lot of touchdowns for a guy that's a second running back. And it's hard to pick a much better spot than playing against the Jaguars when, again, you may have a ton of opportunities to run. I could see him as an option with Mitchell too. Plus the downside risk for Mitchell's playing time. I think it's a really intriguing week. I would consider him as a long shot option, and we're kind of regardless of who shows up for this game. All right, Ron, let's head over to the 4 p.m. window here. We got the Bengals at Raiders, 4:05 in the Dome in Las Vegas. The Bengals lost 2 games heading into their bye. That was a 31-34 loss to the Jets in Week 8, 16-41 loss to the Browns in Week 9, and then the Browns, of course, turn around and get smoked by the Patriots. It's a pretty pessimistic turn of events for a team that we were thinking could end up being a really high playoff seed. But do you think there's any implications of that from a fantasy perspective? Has the losing streak worried you about Joe Burrow or other guys on the Bengals squad?
No, not from a fantasy perspective, and I'm hoping that the bye week kind of set them straight, gave them a little time to get those 2 losses out of their heads, because those were 2 bad losses. To lose to the Jets at all and then to get blown out by the Browns clearly was not good. But no, I really, really like Joe Burrow. T. Higgins, I think, is a great wide receiver, and obviously Jamar Chase has kind of taken the league by storm. And Joe Mixon is having the season that everyone, the people who swear by him is having. So no, I expect everything to get right for the Bengals and then to come out, with a strong offense in this one.
So I mostly agree with you too, Ryan. And Burrow had done either 2 or 3 touchdowns every week until he threw none in Week 9. So you're it's pretty clear what the outlier is from that perspective. But one thing that's interesting for me with Burrow is that he has 20 touchdowns this season, but 13.5 expected touchdowns. Again, this is using the same logic about where those touchdowns are coming from, distance from the end zone wise, air yards wise. So he's basically had a ton of really long touchdowns, the type of throws that tend not to become touchdowns. And his 6.5 touchdown surplus in that respect is the biggest among quarterbacks. What's interesting about this from a quarterback perspective compared to, say, a running back or a wide receiver is that quarterbacks might continue to advance on those drives and eventually get touchdowns. And you tend to see the better quarterbacks have overachieving results there. So Patrick Mahomes has 5.9 surplus this year. Wilson's got a surplus. Murray's got a surplus. Prescott's got a surplus. It's it all kind of points to Burrow maybe kind of breaking out as one of the better quarterbacks in the league. But that being said, I do think he's been a bit lucky to score as many touchdowns as he had, maybe because Joe Mixon would have had some of those touchdowns. Not necessarily a criticism of the offense, but I'll say that Burrow is my 15th quarterback from a fantasy perspective in a true talent sense. So maybe a little bit less than you might think, but he jumps up to 10th this week in what I think is a plus matchup facing the Raiders, but being in the Dome, which I think is a really nice benefit as well. So some good, some bad there.
I think a lot of the touchdowns just come from Chase. I mean,
he's been amazing.
He makes big plays and takes, 10-yard passes and turns them to 75-yard touchdowns.
It's true. I can't remember the last time that a rookie wide receiver was this impactful. I guess unless you want to count Justin Jefferson last year. Yeah, maybe it's just a really sweet time for wide receivers in the NFL. I mean, it's fun stuff. Really taking a different tact here with the wide receivers, my DFS play for the week for this game is actually Hunter Renfrow at 6,100 in FanDuel. I think that's modestly underpriced at 600. Modest is kind of the name of the game here because it's not like he's had a huge breakout after the team released Henry Ruggs 2 weeks ago, but his 65% and 72% snap shares the last 2 weeks are 2 of his 4 highest totals of the season. He's had 9 targets the last 2 weeks. That's tied for his most for the season. So while Renfrow isn't filling the role that Ruggs played, it does seem like his workload has ticked up since the absence. And is that kind of like driving my interest for him in a DFS perspective? Do you feel the same way, or do you think there's a different Raider here that might end up benefiting longer term?
No, I like Renfrow a lot. I think he's going to be, a guy that every week you're going to be able to consider, and it's just the consistency and the volume. Like that's what DFS, wide receivers are to me. It's volume. That's what obviously if you're not getting thrown the ball, you're not, getting as many catches. And Renfrow's not going to have a 75-yard touchdown. He's not going to catch 165 yards, but he's going to get you, 5 or 6 catches, 60 to 70 yards basically every week. And then when he finds the end zone, you get that little extra bonus bump. Yeah. And when you're looking for, a guy at 6,100, that's not really a high salary on DraftKings. I think he's a great play. Obviously he's the safety net for David Carr, along with, obviously Waller. But I mean, where else are you getting excited? You're not excited about Brian Edwards. You're not excited about Zay Jones. Deshaun Jackson caught one pass and then he gave it to the other team. So there's not a lot of options here to throw to. So I really like Renfrow. I think he's a nice rock piece at not a high price.
Absolutely. All right, we've made it to the game of the week. Cowboys at Chiefs, 4:25 Eastern time in Kansas City, 56 degrees and clear with some wind, 16 miles per hour, but probably not enough to mute these two high-powered offenses. But I do want to zag here a bit, Ryan, because I want to ask not about the offenses, but whether the Chiefs defense is still the plus-plus matchup that we thought of them from the early season. The team is still tied for 30th, or they're ranked 30th in defensive DVOA overall for the full season, but I've noticed they've trended very positively of late. So let me do the DVOA by week defensively. Positive numbers are bad in this case. 38%, 22%, 12%, 23%, 65%. Those are all horrible for the first 5 games. Negative 25%, aka 25% better than average. 8.5%, negative 8%, still better than average. Negative 12%, negative 2%. So that's a better than average defensive performance in 4 of the last 5 games. I don't know if that's schedule or what, but is it possible the Chiefs defense is actually trending in the right direction here?
Yeah, I don't think it was, I don't think it was ever as bad as it looked, earlier in the year, or it shouldn't have been, I guess I'll say. They're not that bad. Are they good? No. They made David Carr look real bad. Did I say David Carr? Derek Carr.
Whichever Carr, brother. We're good.
Everyone made David Carr look bad. But Derek Carr, he looked really bad in that last game. And yeah, I think they are improving, but I think the Cowboys offense is too good. I think that this is going to be a lot of points. I believe this is the highest over-under in Vegas this week. So I do expect that Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper and all, I think they're going to get theirs. I think I won't be surprised if both teams finish in the 30s in this one.
Yeah, I'm not going to dispute that point. I mean, I think the Cowboys may be too good of an offense for any defense to really slow down in any real way. But I do think it's interesting to note that I would say in particular with the run defense. So I do these run defense factors. They work kind of like park factors in baseball. So they suggest how much percentage over or under an average team a team is allowing various stats. And 5 or 6 weeks ago, they were allowing 50% increases in touchdowns per carry. Now they're 20% under. So this may not be the slam dunk rushing matchup you would expect for a guy like Ezekiel Elliott. Not enough to bench him. I mean, you're not going to bench a player like him in any week in fantasy, but is he going to have 2 rushing touchdowns this week? I'm not so sure. And so from a DFS perspective, that may not be the way that I would lean this week with the Chiefs. I would say, even if they're not great, I think defensively, they're much better than everybody expects they are at this point. And I think that's kind of the trap you can fall in here. And so more broadly from a DFS perspective, I'm going to jump back in on Travis Kelce at this point instead of looking at the Cowboys. Kelce is obviously expensive the way he always is, 7,100 in DraftKings, but this is maybe the only time all year I've seen him as being underpriced in the format. And I don't really have a great statistical piece of evidence for this, but I'll say that he had a clear slump. That period when the Chiefs offense was playing really badly, he had 16 catches, 160 yards, and a touchdown combined over 3 games from week 7 to 9. And last week, it's 8 catches for 119 yards. Slumps like that can happen. Big games like that can happen at any time for players. But I'm curious if maybe Kelce was hurt, if there was something going on there, and he just looked explosive and prime self to me last week. So I'm going to roll back here with Kelce. Do you think that I'm seeing too much that isn't there? Or do you think that Kelce really may have turned a corner in a weird way for a guy that's been as successful as he has for 6 years?
I think they might have all turned the corner. Just over the last few weeks watching the Chiefs, it just seemed like they were as shocked as that they were performing as bad as we were. You watch Mahomes walk off the field, and he's just like had no idea why all of a sudden all this stuff that's been working for the past 3 years all of a sudden isn't working for him. So yeah, they certainly got well against the Raiders last week, and you can just never go wrong with Travis Kelce.
All right, a few more games to hit on here. Still at the 425 window here. Cardinals at Seahawks in Seattle, 46 degrees and clear. Ryan, Russell Wilson got shut out for the first time in his career last week. He's coming off the broken finger. Is it time to panic on him in fantasy?
I gotta admit, I'm a little worried. I'm just a little worried he tried to come back too soon, or maybe because he's just a driven guy who always wants to be out there, always wants to help his team, and maybe he needs more time. So yeah, based on how terrible he looked last week against the Packers defense, which is all right, but nothing mind-boggling. Yeah, I'm a little worried that he might not be quite 100% and is trying to tough it out and might not be helping his team that way.
I mean, I'm worried about the health. I mean, I think there's no way around that. And so anytime you're going to be using him in the short term, it could blow up in your face. But I do think there are two things that kind of pop out to me here. One with the Packers, while they may be no great shakes from an overall perspective this year, they clearly have been trending defensively even before this game. So they were the 6th worst defensive DVOA team in weeks 1 to 6, but the 7th best one in weeks 7 to 9. And given that they have a new defensive coordinator this year, to me, it's less of a surprise that there might have been like a period of adjustment to the defensive improvements. I think they actually may be an above average defense right now. So that's one point of it too. But I'm glad you're here because you're kind of a projections nerd like myself. Let's get really nerdy with this. I have a theory here. I've talked a little bit about the too high safety look that's kind of become very popular in the NFL of late. It's been like the Vic Fangio and Brandon Staley style defense that's really taken off. And it's really good at preventing like success of play action passes, one of the big analytical trends in recent seasons, but it's also kind of designed to eliminate big plays for downfield throwers. I'm going to kind of cheat and tie this into the next game too, because my question for that game is whether there's anything wrong with Justin Herbert. And it's something that I've noticed with a lot of the quarterbacks that have a lot of success with the deeper passes. I think maybe they're struggling because of the prevalence of the too high safety look this season. It's not just Patrick Mahomes. But let me read off the guys that were the leading deep fantasy point percentage guys from last year, and we can say whether they've been struggling this year or not. Patrick Mahomes scored 27% of his fantasy points on deep passes. He seems to be struggling this year, right? Kyler Murray, no. Aaron Rodgers, 25% of his passes from deep passes. He's kind of struggling a little bit this year from a fantasy perspective. Matthew Stafford, 24%. Not fair to say he's struggling. I think he's really enjoyed the improvements with the Rams offense, but of late has been struggling to get the ball down the field. Daniel Jones, Justin Herbert, 23% of his passes are deep for deep scoring. Russell Wilson, 22%. Do you think there's anything in the fact that the guys that maybe got a lot of their fantasy success throwing down the field are now seeing defenses adjust to specifically stop the thing that they do well? Is there anything there, or am I getting too much into the weeds here in your mind?
No, I definitely think that's part of it, and especially with Mahomes. I think you're seeing that an awful lot. I don't know that I've dug deep enough to hit all 7 of these guys, but I definitely think that's a factor with Mahomes. And yeah, I mean, eventually you have to figure these defensive coordinators, they make a lot of money, and this is their job. Of course they're going to do everything they can to try to figure it out. And it certainly seems like not the Raiders necessarily last week, but even that they wasn't like huge deep throws by Mahomes. It was a lot of shorter things that just happened to go well, and the Raiders couldn't tackle. But yeah, I think there's certainly something to your theory here.
And that's the thing with the Raiders too, is that they don't ever play any too high safety looks, and they basically didn't last week either. I mean, their deep coordinator Gus Bradley is very much of the Seattle mold of the traditional like safety playing in the box Cam Chancellor style, and it's tough because not every team has the right personnel to play that way. So it's not going to be an every week situation, but it's something that I definitely have my eyes on, and I'll be curious to see what ends up happening with the team this week. We're back here at the Cardinals and Seahawks game as a bit of a reset. From a DFS angle, I'm kind of looking away from the passing game because I have those question marks. And I think James Conner is the player that I think I'll recommend here at 6,100 in DraftKings. I think that's pretty markedly underpriced, and it's because while he was splitting time with Chase Edmonds was getting pretty much all of the work as a receiver. He was out-targeted 36-5 before Edmonds ended up suffering his injury. But Conner has now seen 9 targets the last 2 weeks versus none for Eno Benjamin. So while Benjamin is getting worked in a little bit, Conner is playing much more of a bell cow role, getting both rushes and receptions of late. And to me, his prices haven't caught up yet. Do you feel the same way about Conner? And do you think does he need Kyler Murray for that to work for you in fantasy, or would you trust him either way?
I'll probably trust him either way. I think it definitely helps with Murray. I believe he's going to be a game time call, but I don't think they're going to have DeAndre Hopkins again this week. So that leaves, Christian Kirk and AJ Green and
Rondale
Zach,
Moore hasn't been playing
Rondale
as much as you'd expect. Yeah.
So I think they definitely want to rely on the run game. Being in Seattle, it's not as nice as it would be in Phoenix in the Dome. So I think they want to chew it up some with Connor. So I think he's a great call.
Yeah. The Sunday night game is the Steelers at Chargers, 8:20 p.m. in LA in the Dome. I mentioned it a little bit with my previous theory, but do you have any other thoughts about Justin Herbert? Are you still as excited as you were, or are you concerned that it's been kind of a rough slate of it over the last month or so for him from a fantasy perspective?
I think he's going to be okay. He is one of my favorite fantasy quarterbacks. You see him littered all over my season-long teams. I think it's a little bit of a downswing. The teams have been taking Mike Williams out of the equation, so yeah. I do still think he'll be okay. Steelers defense has been a little bit better of late. There's still, the secondary isn't awesome. Yeah. So I don't necessarily think that this is a 350-yard, 3-touchdown game for Herbert, but I think he still can grab you 16, 18 points.
Yeah, I wish this game was at 1 p.m. because we may not know about Roethlisberger, until it's too late to set your fantasy lineups. But I do want to advocate Pat Freiermuth, especially if we get word that Roethlisberger is able to play. Freiermuth is at 5,200 in FanDuel. I think that's 600 underpriced. For one, the Chargers, we talk about their run defense being terrible all the time, but they're a really good matchup for opposing tight ends as well. They've allowed 8 touchdowns to tight ends on the season in 9 games. They allowed 2 to Tyler Conklin last week. So I think it's a great spot for Freiermuth from a fantasy perspective. Plus, he has a 19% target share since week 6 when Juju Smith-Schuster went out for the year. That's top 10 at the position. I think Freiermuth is definitely trending up. Do you feel that way as well?
Definitely, and I don't know how I can improve on that than everything you just threw out. Definitely, he's a great call.
Great. Then let's shift over to the Monday night game before we hit on those YouTube questions. We got the Giants at Buccaneers Monday at 8:15 in Tampa, 66 degrees and clear, but with some 15-mile-an-hour winds being a possible factor. What are your thoughts on the Bucs defense? I mean, last year, especially in the second half of the season, they were one of the more fearsome groups, a big limiter of both rushing efficiency and rushing carries per game. But they have so many injuries at this point. I'm not sure if it's something that you want to be scared of in fantasy. What do you think?
No, I don't think that you need to be scared of in fantasy. It's just a matter of what weapons of the Giants are you going to trust. I mean, it's looking like Saquon Barkley is might be good to go for this one. But outside of Jamel Dean, like you said, their secondary has just been torn apart by injuries. So while Dean may be locking up Kenny Galladay, does that open the door for Kadarius Toney to have a big game? We'll see if Sterling Shepard is going to play. I don't think he's going to. So maybe this is a Toney breakout. He's kind of like the guy I feel like wants to do extra on Monday night because they're the only game and make a little bit of a name for himself because he seems to have a little bit of that diva tendency in him. So I kind of, that might not be the most technical reasons, but that's kind of why I'm going after him on Monday night.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say at this point, I'm not afraid from the Bucs from a passing perspective. Especially with Carlton Davis and Sean Murphy-Bunting, they've both been out on injured reserve. Richard Sherman, one of their replacements, is on injured reserve now. Jason Pierre-Paul's been playing with a torn rotator cuff. So a lot of the pass rush and defense type of elements have been bad. But then last week, Vita Vea suffered a bone bruise. He may miss a few games, may end up on IR too. So even right now, I'm not sure I'm terrified of a running back in the matchup. So like you mentioned, if we know that Saquon Barkley is able to go, I think I'm going to probably play him pretty confidently if we feel like from a health perspective, he's going to make it work. At the DFS angle of this, I was looking at Tyler Johnson as a nice value at 3,400 in DraftKings. His snap share jumped from 16% in week 6 to over 60% the last 3 games, while Antonio Brown and Gronk have been out. But there's kind of breaking news late that Gronk returned to practice finally on Thursday. Again, it's tricky with the Monday night game, but Gronk may play. Does that kind of affect your decision-making here, or what are your thoughts on Tyler Johnson as a possible deep league guy?
A deep league guy, it's possible. I was thinking it was 2 weeks ago. He had a pretty good game. I believe he did not that much last week against Washington, although I guess no one did all that much.
They had a rough day.
Yeah. Mike Evans will probably see a lot of James Bradbury, but I do like Chris Godwin a lot. Johnson, dart throw again, if you're looking to save some value or save some salary, he's certainly someone you can look at. I expect a much better offensive game this week for Tampa Bay.
Same. Okay, we've got some questions to hit on here before we wrap things up. As mentioned, guys, we are live. It's actually Monday through Friday, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can watch us live on YouTube or on Facebook, Twitch, or Twitter. But if you join us on YouTube, you can ask us questions. Let's hit on some of the fantasy ones heading into Week 11 here. Mix of Waves asks, how much would you guys trust Kyler Murray if he's able to play this week? I mean, it's a complicating factor that I think isn't his game at 4. So you may have to make a bit of a fantasy decision before you know for sure if he is going to play. I would say that in general, I'm probably never going to bench Murray if he's active, but it does worry me that last season toward the second half of the year, when he was a bit injured, he started running the ball a lot less than he had previously. So like, is he going to be a top 3 type of fantasy quarterback if he plays this week? That's where I may quibble a little bit. So maybe avoid him from DFS perspective, but play him in your traditional leagues. But what do you think about that, Ryan?
Yeah, it's hard to sit him if he's active. You know, we spoke a little bit earlier about James Conner and running the ball. The Seahawks secondary, DJ Reed is a pretty solid corner, but it is tough. You know, if you don't know going into Sunday, it depends on your other option. I mean, if your other option is Tua, then I'm probably, which we talked nicely about earlier, but still, if your other option is Tua, I'm probably going with Kyler Murray. If for some reason you have another really solid quarterback, I'd look another direction, but it's the guy's really good.
Agreed. All right, Smokey the cat. There's multiple cats there. I'm a little confused. He has a question. 1 flex, Bateman, Gallup, Dante Foreman, or Tony Pollard from a fantasy this weekend. This may be one where PPR or non-PPR is an important distinction, but let's just assume it's a PPR format. I mentioned with the Cowboys that I think that the Chiefs' run defense is a lot better than you probably think it is. So it's probably not Pollard for me, and I don't think it's Gallup either. So I think I'm looking at either Bateman or Dante Foreman. God, I got to say, I really like Bateman. I was really encouraged that even when Sammy Watkins returned to the lineup, he still got a lot more snaps played. It still seems to be one of Lamar's preferred third down options. He's a player I'm kind of counting on as like a 5 or 6 catch guy per week. And if it's a PPR format, that's definitely going to be better than what Foreman does. Do you feel the same way, Ryan?
Actually, yeah, I do. That was where I was leaning right from the start. If the Tennessee running game, was a little bit more well-defined, then it might be different. But, we spoke earlier about how you kind of don't know going into this week. And while Foreman is trending up, is it enough to use that kind of a roster spot on? So I would go with Bateman as well.
So, and Smokey the cat has another question too. Rest of season, Elijah Moore or Kadarius Toney. You brought up earlier about Sterling Shepard potentially missing this game. I do think it's interesting that Toney had his best game of the season when he was playing almost exclusively in the slot as a substitute slot option for Sterling Shepard, who normally plays there. So I think I like Toney a lot better from the slot than I like him outside as a fantasy option for the rest of the year. But I just feel like when Shepard comes back, I'm not sure it's going to be there for him. So I think I lean more there. What about you?
It's kind of a coin flip. They're both in kind of strange situations. Neither one is in a great offense. Neither one is the preferred option. I would say Moore has less competition, although Toney has a better quarterback or for whoever the Jets are throwing out. But if I had to pick one, I would go with Moore as well.
Yeah. He also follows up that whether he should start Russell or Tua this week at quarterback. I know I said some either negative or conspiratorial thoughts about why Wilson has had kind of a relatively down year. But to me, I would start Wilson every week over Tua, even if it's a difficult matchup. I just think their sort of calibers of quarterback and fantasy quarterback are different enough that I would trust the veteran there. What about you?
I hate to say this, but I'm going the other direction. Between the quarterback, between the injury concern and going against the Cardinals, who are a decent secondary, although they've got scored on a lot last week. Miami's got the Jets, and Tua's been pretty decent. So I'm going to go unconventional here and go against Russell Wilson.
I like it. All right, one more question, and then we can wrap this thing up from Deacon. Hey, guys, he's got Saquon Barkley. Should he be worried about starting him Monday? We talked a little bit about Barkley before, and I would say that, from a matchup perspective, I'm a lot less scared about the Bucs defense than I would be typically. So, in that sense, I'm not scared of starting Barkley if we know he's healthy. What I would be scared about is the fact that this is a Monday night game. We don't know right now whether Barkley's going to be able to play or not. So I think if I had any kind of decent option that I had to put in my lineups by 1 p.m. on Sunday, I might make that move. But if you could maybe protect yourself with Devontae Booker, that's where I might be a little bit more feeling confident in that option. Is that how you would handle it, or would you go a different way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just really pay attention to what you're hearing. If we get a lot more positive news and you feel a lot better about it, sure. And definitely if Booker is there, finding a spot for him in his roster just in case. because obviously Leonard Fournette's not going to be available, and you don't want Ronald Jones. So that's guys from the other team. So I'm feeling good about Barkley from what I've read so far. So I think tentatively I put him into my lineup, but I would certainly have a plan B in case things don't sound quite so great by Sunday morning.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Why don't you tell everybody where they can catch all of your work and catch your other stuff going on?
Just go over to fantasyalarm.com and dfsalarm.com. I do a wide receiver cornerback article every week that drops on Thursday, but the staff there, we just do so much content, from Howard Bender's playbook to we have a coach article for every position, snap count stuff. Our tools are top notch. There's just so much over there. Go to fantasyalarm.com, and we'll help you win.
I highly encourage everybody to check out Ryan's work and everything going over there on Fantasy Alarm. It's great stuff. Before we run out of here, I'll mention too that you should catch us back again next week. We're live Monday through Wednesday next week, Thanksgiving week. We'll do live streams at 1 p.m. Eastern time, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Twitch. And one last time, FO Plus is now on sale for 99 cents a week for annual subscriptions. It's a limited time offer, so go to footballoutsiders.com/subscribe or follow the link in the description of the show to check all of that out. We got through it all. Hope this was helpful for everybody. I hope everyone has a lot of great luck in their Week 11 fantasy matchups. Hope you win that. And then meanwhile, come back next week and catch us again. We'll keep this thing going. Thanks so much, Ryan. Thanks again for being on.